Perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. As usual, to our audience here in Bedford Square and to our online audience. We are now at the end of our PGWiP year, PGWiP calendar year. So it's our last seminar for the summer term and for the year. So we will present the new chairs as well very soon. But today I'm very pleased to welcome Thomas Clements from Manchester. Thomas did his BA at the University of Lancaster, BA in History, and then he moved to Manchester, where he did his MA in Classics and Ancient History. He then stayed in Manchester, where he's doing now a PhD in Classics and Ancient History, working on a thesis entitled Lacedaemon, Social Relations and Political Integrity in the Southern Peloponnese, working under the supervision of Professor Stephen Todd. So we are very happy to have him today speaking about hanging around the Spartan economy, Perioikoi as economic actors. Thank you very much, Thomas. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. This should run just shy of 40 minutes. I say that because I once sat down to a seminar where someone said, before they started reading their paper, they said, "This is just over an hour, I hope that's okay," and then just started speaking. So you can have that sort of forward to. I thought we would, do we need to screen share for the PDF?
PDF. So that
yeah. Great. So I thought we would start with some knowledge. We know that Sparta had three main status groups: the Holloway, the Perioikoi, and the Helots. These three groups made up the majority of the population. We know that Sparta had an agrarian economy underpinned by the slave labour of the Helots. This system was the basis of their power. It afforded the Spartiates the leisure to act as full-time citizen soldiers and partake in all the elements of citizen life. The Spartiate-Helot relationship was obviously central to all of this. Now, this is the reconstruction that has essentially been developed over the past 20 years by Stephen Hodkinson and others. My aim here is not to raise substantial objections, rather to flesh out one element of the picture that has remained somewhat neglected, the Perioikoi. They're by far the most obscure of Sparta's status groups. I'm going to here reconsider the nature of their economic role, attempting to get away from discussions of citizenship, political dependency, and military obligation. A brief synthesis of previous scholarship runs something like this. Whilst the Homoioi were busy training for war, and the Helots were busy toiling in the fields and managing their masters' estates, the Perioikoi took up the slack of economic functions. The genesis of this view lay in Xenophon's suggestion, not on the handout, that in Sparta, Lycurgus prohibited free men, eleutheroi, from having anything to do with the acquisition of wealth. He ordered them to consider that their only appropriate tasks were those that promote the freedom of cities. Xenophon goes on to describe how the Lycurgan system provided citizens, what we assume is meant by free men, with all the necessities of life. Now, in a 1974 article, Ridley sought to criticise this view through collecting together all the available textual evidence for industry within Spartan territory. The paper itself is light on primary source references and does not utilise what would have been valuable archaeological material and geological or environmental data on the region itself. However, the problem as Ridley framed it is basically correct. Quote, "Certainly it is not sound to posit a simple tripartite division in Sparta of Spartiates, Perioikoi, and Helots, and allot duties to the second, the least understood of all, by a process of elimination." Ridley was also keenly aware of the methodological issues surrounding this topic. Whilst one could plausibly make connections between resources that lay within Perioikic territory and industries that developed around these resources, we are in serious want of any direct evidence. To be clear, studies have also confirmed that there was probably no absolute ban on full citizens practicing manual crafts, even if it was strongly discouraged. So craft production was never just limited to the Perioikoi. Yet until we find some new textual or epigraphic evidence, I have my doubts as to whether the problems outlined by Ridley can be escaped. It is easier to lay down an epistemological challenge than it is to answer it. In addition to Ridley's worries, there are further difficulties in writing Spartan economic history. Greek discourses around wealth and poverty tended to downplay economic and social distinctions. This middling tendency is clearly visible in Sparta. As Stephen Hodkinson has demonstrated, the numerous measures designed to promote communality in Spartiate life, the payment of mess dues and the sharing of property in certain contexts, would have had no practical effect on economic inequalities between homoioi. This ideological precept forms a number of historical erasures. It denies the validity of economic inequalities within the full citizen body and excludes the Perioikoi from the dominant economic discourse. Conversely, we are better informed about the lives of helots, since they were central to the Spartan economic system. The lack of scholarship on this issue betrays the limits of a political understanding of the Perioikoi, which has formed the basis of most scholarship on them. We know that a Perioikos was also a Lacedaemonian, as shown by a number of explicit statements by ancient authors, many in Thucydides. There is no evidence that the Perioikoi had any meaningful role in political decision-making. In short, if we confine our studies to the limited political role the Perioikoi played, then our understanding will remain limited. So what obligations, if any, did Perioikoi have to the Lacedaemonian polis in peacetime? I'm leaving to one side here the issue of military obligations, since in my view these are of a slightly different character. The issue of Perioikoi as a manpower resource called upon in war has formed the basis of much of the recent work on the Perioikoi, and this does reflect the nature of our evidence. But it also reflects a tendency for elements of Sparta's domestic history to become interesting when they have some external consequence, helot revolts or figures of Perioikoi in the army, for example. And it is from this that we're compelled to reconstruct the social system. This is a process fraught with difficulties, especially if Hodkinson is right and Sparta was far less militaristic a society than is generally believed. So in that vein, let's start with something much more interesting than war: tax. The financial arrangements within Sparta, Aristotle says the following, and this is 1a on the handout, so I won't bother to read that out. Reflecting a similar theme, the Thucydidean Archidamus, urging the Spartan assembly not to go to war with Athens, says, "Our finances then. In this respect we are also deficient, and by some way. There is nothing in our public treasury, and we do not readily make contributions from our private means." It is not quite clear how the system of taxation was meant to function, although trust between homoioi appears to have been one essential element. Attention has been paid to Aristotle's qualification that Spartiates owned the majority of land in the territory. Hodkinson suggests that the land of Perioikoi was also included in calculations pertinent to the taxation system, and that they too may well have been subject to eis forai payments. If this is true, then we may further reiterate, if it's not too obvious, that Perioikoi possessed assets of a significant level, that they were subject to eis forai payments. This was not an obligation to core, in my view, but simply one which applied to Perioikoi with sufficiently large assets. Certain Perioikoi were also subject in some loose fashion to the direct authority of the kings. Xenophon tells us, and I think this passage, yes, 1c on the handout, how they granted choice bits of land in Perioikic territory, and 1d on the handout from Alcibiades 1 talks about the riches of the Lacedaemonians and the kings in particular, so I won't bother to read these out. We can here safely ignore the attribution to the Lycurgus. We can also downplay the claim that the kings held modest estates. Xenophon here is attempting to downplay the wealth and power of the kings and focus more on the communally minded aspects of the Spartan politeia. The fact that no other class or institution is mentioned here might suggest it references a legal relationship that predates the full development of Spartan institutions and might reflect how the Perioikoi were earlier incorporated into the polis of the Lacedaemonians. The kings expressed their control, symbolic or actual, of the Perioikis through taking possession of a certain of its estates from which they later received an income. Shipley has in fact suggested that this land was gifted by the newly incorporated polis to the kings, as opposed to being seized or compulsorily purchased. This may also provide some context for Aristotle's somewhat confusing comment that they, we presume the Spartans, this is in the politics, not on the handout, say that in the times of their early kings, they allowed others a share in their constitution. If Shipley is right, then this may suggest some early degree of reciprocity in relations within the emergent status structure of Sparta, i.e. before the categories of Perioikos and Homoios had reached full definition. The claim that this passage, when read in concert with pseudo-Plato, refers to tribute paid to the kings has been firmly rejected, I think. Herodotus makes no mention of money payments being made to the kings, and all such privileges appear to be paid entirely in kind, such as double rations and the right to sacrificial victims, etc. Lipka argues that this passage might be referring to the income they would have received from their estates across Laconia and Messenia. Now, phoros can mean a general payment, but there is no sense that this meaning can extend to income from an asset. Furthermore, if one wanted to lay aside questions of strict terminological usage, i.e. Plato simply being inconsistent, then tribute or payment meaning income does not seem like a particularly plausible error, unless I suppose it's some kind of ideological usage, but that's a point we can discuss. Lipka's suggestion is philologically speculative and does not aid us in historical interpretation. It should be stated, however, that monetary obligation was one element of royal power, just not in the form of tribute. Herodotus tells us that whenever a king dies and another succeeds him, the one acceding the throne forgives anyone who owes a debt either to the king or to the public treasury. Anyone of the Spartiati, I should say. This provision suggests that money lending was going on between citizens and other institutions of the polis. It is possible that the Perioikoi were also able to borrow money from the kings, but that their debts would not be forgiven in the event of a death. What is the overall impression of these seemingly limited obligations? The presence of royal estates could have had potentially very little impact on the daily life of Perioikoi. There is no firm evidence of direct material or financial obligation. Certainly, some of the Perioikoi might have been subject to the aesphora, even though the precise functioning of this institution in Sparta remains obscure. Therefore, if our limited evidence is indicative, Perioikoi were not tied to the Spartan polis by some close financial obligation, and it does not seem that Sparta had a great institutional reach. This also tells us something of the economic situation. If it was in fact true that Homoioi did possess the majority of land, whether this refers to arable land or not is another matter, then we should assume that Perioikoi had nowhere near the potential to accrue wealth in the same manner and to the same degree as Homoioi. This would suggest, as both McDowell and Shipley thought, that Perioikic polis were in some sense legally independent, with separate regimes of land ownership. In Attica, it has been variously adduced that the wealthiest individuals, roughly 2,000 on Osborne and Foxall's independent estimations, own between a quarter and a third of all cultivatable land. Whilst Osborne is less confident about the status of those who worked the land, Foxall argues that since control of the landscape was in the hands of the rich, there would have been limited scope for a self-sufficient group of peasant farmers to develop. Transposing these arguments to Sparta, it should come as no surprise that the Homoioi, economically and politically, controlled the Laconian and Messenian countryside. It might be a bit more controversial, however, to argue that they had similar consequences. In one recent discussion of patronage in Sparta, Ingvar Mailer largely accepts the potential routes of patronage laid out by Hodkinson, which focuses on the full citizen body and foreign guest friends. For Mailer, patronage was a public enterprise. It was institutionalized with a view to creating citizens and strengthening the state. The Perioikoi only enter this picture as commanders in positions of responsibility in the army or as foster children, trophimoi, of Spartiate families. However, this reconstruction explains one cause of patronage, a lack of political power, yet does not totally address another reason that patronage might become part of society: economic scarcity. Mailer and others are not describing patronage per se, but political clientism, which is merely one facet of patronage. It seems fair to suggest that not all clients were aiming to join the ranks of the Homoioi. which of course came with its own series of heavy material obligations, it is clear that political disenfranchisement is closely connected to social and economic exclusion. Yet too much attention has been paid to the political identity of the Perioikoi within Lacedaemon and not enough discussion of the social and the economic. And that is what I propose to do for the remainder of this paper. We shall begin with the klaros, the allotment, not because it was the most basic unit of the Spartan economy, but because it was essential to the economic and agricultural structure of the countryside, representing an important site of economic activity and social interaction. It seems likely that Perioikoi could have acted as bailiffs on these estates. The demands of full Spartan citizenship, residency in Sparta itself, mess contributions, etc., most likely necessitated long absences, so that, quote, as far as their estates were concerned, the probability is that most Spartaic landowners were effectively absentees. And that's Hodkinson there. In Sparta, it has been assumed that this function would have been performed by helots. An entry in Hesychios preserves the term monoia nomoi, Gloucester's ton hyloton acontes, leaders of the helots. Ducat and Hodkinson both have suggested that these individuals were drawn from within the helot communities themselves and necessarily reflected their structure. Hodkinson also suggested that Perioikoi could have fulfilled wider roles as estate managers in the Russian sense of managing the scattered holdings of landowners. This second suggestion appears to be supported by additional evidence concerning bailiffs. Xenophon in his Oikonomicus said someone could work as a bailiff even if he had no resources of his own. In the Memorabilia, I think we can turn to the, yes. In the Memorabilia, Socrates advises Oithoros on the need to work as a bailiff, which obviously I won't read out, it's on the handout. Although I think the one telling aspect of this passage is Oithoros' reply that I should not want to submit myself to slavery. Now it's important to emphasize here that Oithoros is most probably a dispossessed, formerly wealthy cleric, and we need not see his reaction as indicative of any Athenian in this context. His disgust is also not with working for others per se, but being in the employment of another long term. He has no issue, for example, with toisomati egazomenos, working with his body. Exetheos, the defendant in Demosthenes against Oibulides, makes some similar comments concerning the necessity of wage labour. If these comments reflect historical reality, then we may also suggest that, as with helot bailiffs, the relationship with the landholder was necessarily one of trust and, by association, a relatively secure and lengthy contract. That this role garnered some prestige within locales is suggested by an earlier comment of Critoboulos in the Oikonomicus, replying to Socrates' question about the role of the bailiff. I think this... Yes, it's all on my handout. We now turn to the slightly more difficult problem of Perioikoi acting as wage labourers, which is an entirely speculative argument of mine. I'll confess that now. Helot labour is the resource on which the Spartan economy was built. However, it could be prone to shortages. Of all the examples of helots being killed by the Lacedaemonians, there is no evidence that slaveholders ever received compensation for what was in effect a capital loss. There is no evidence that the polis could easily compensate slaveholders with a like-for-like from helots they owned directly. Of those helots conscripted into the army as either brasidioi, neodamideis, or light-armed troops, there is no evidence of compensation to the slaveholder. Interestingly, we do have some scant evidence of helots being compensated in property they themselves possessed in the Sphacteria episode. In Sparta, slaveholders were also banned from selling helots beyond the borders of Spartan territory and privately manumitting them. These measures sought to preserve the labour supply that formed the bedrock of Spartan power, and also limited the means by which helots themselves could change their status. There is also very little evidence of non-helotic slaves in Sparta, purchased in either foreign or domestic slave markets. Therefore, in the event of a sudden labour shortage, homoioi, or their bailiffs, had two possible sources of additional labour. One, other people's helots, or two, Perioikoi. The first option is easy enough. Xenophon says, in a passage which I hope is on the handout. Yes, there it is, 2D. The first option is easy enough. Xenophon says that the Kyrgyz permitted homoioi to make use of each other's slaves if the need required it. If a slaveholder suddenly found themselves in need of short-term labour, then they could draw on the generosity of a messmate or other acquaintance. On the part of the lender, this could also be seen as their duty as a citizen. The public access to private property extended not just to what the polis was able to do, but also to what the individual was compelled to do. Considering the communitarian character of this arrangement, slaveholders may not have charged the borrower for a day's upkeep of their slave, as was the case in Athens and elsewhere. That said, considering Sparta did maintain a system of private property, we should not completely exclude this possibility. And we don't have any evidence for it anyway, so there. Option two is slightly trickier. There is no direct evidence of wage labour in Sparta. The following argument simply pieces together how such a system may have functioned. The Perioikoi cannot have been economically homogeneous. The named Perioikoi mentioned by Xenophon, those who held positions of leadership within the army, are most likely to have been from the elite. If Aristotle is correct, and the majority of land was held by the homoioi, then Perioikoi might have struggled to access land, or at least might be forced to settle for medium to small-sized holdings, which they were required to farm fairly intensively, as perhaps for some poorer homoioi. It is a priori likely that if Perioikoi had fairly small holdings, then they could receive very little income. Wage labour was most likely required to support the household. The lot of the wage labourer is summarised tersely by David Shapt in his book on monetisation. Quote, when there was work to be done, a person might work and get paid. When there was no work to be done, that person could look elsewhere or starve. Wouldn't want to be employed by Shapts. It's also been suggested that the plentiful supply of slaves in Greece prevented the development of a system of long-term free employment. Wage labour therefore maintained an ad hoc character, wrapping itself around a more stable and indeed coerced labour supply. It was nonetheless common in the Greek world. Archaic poetry contains apparent references to a system of occasional wage labour. In the Odyssey, it is said of Lamos that there a man who never slept could earn a double wage, one by herding cattle, the other by pasturing sheep. Hesiod says, and I urge you to throw out your day labourer, your thes, and to seek out a maid without children, since a maid with a child is a pain. In classical Athens, wage labourers were a fact of economic life. In the Wasps, Bedecleon says to Philocleon, and now it's as if you are the olive gatherers. You follow the one who pays you. The Erytheian building accounts, by far the most detailed source anywhere in the Greek world for assessing the composition of the real workforce, reveal a complete mixture of employment terms. Some workers were contracted for the day or for a longer term as individuals, although this still appears to have been calculated in terms of a daily rate. Lower paid workers, such as the labour teams tasked with fluting the columns, were paid at what appears to have been a predetermined rate for the entire task. Women also acted as wage labourers, largely as wet nurses, market sellers, midwives, and in other occasional agricultural labour. So if all this information is indicative, in short, occasional and unsystematic wage labour was a common practice of economic life. So how would this have worked in Sparta? Unskilled agricultural labour is one possibility. As suggested above, to supplement helot work teams at high points of the agricultural year, or in the event of a sudden shortage of slave labour. If we were to be more explicit about the composition of this labour force, then we should emphasise the agricultural seasonality of ancient economies. This defined both the availability and desirability of labour, and was also tempered by local conditions. This would suggest that a closer understanding of local economies in Laconia and Messenia might permit greater speculation as to the composition of this occasional labour force. I'm increasingly starting to think that in order to do that properly, there isn't really the textual evidence available, and the lack of epigraphy means that we can't get too far with that. So it's a detailed appreciation of the resources available within particular micro-regions within Laconia and Messenia, and kind of the character of archaeological evidence, but that's another topic for another time. Animal husbandry is another option. Turning again to Alcibiades 1, this is 2e on the handout. The agricultural wealth of Spartan estates is emphasised, particularly in horses and kind of various modes of animal husbandry in Messene. This passage paints a vivid picture of complex, diversified estates with reasonably high levels of animal husbandry. Hodkinson, in his influential chapter on the topic, argues that Spartiates could support larger flocks at greater expense, owing to their superior wealth. In his victory monument, originally erected in the sanctuary of Athene Chalkioikos on the Spartan Acropolis, a certain Damenon refers to victories won with horses he himself had bred. If, as Hodkinson suggests, Damenon was in fact a long-term breeder of horses and had not merely continued to purchase them for the purpose of racing, unlikely, I think, given the extent of the victory catalogue, then this would have incurred extensive costs. Horse breeders required extensive land holdings, both for grazing and fodder, provisions for stabling and grooming, as well as the additional costs associated with chariot racing. Apologies. Horses also figure prominently in some recent archaeological finds at Sparta. Excavations by the 5th Ephorus of prehistoric and classical antiquities on the site of what is believed to be a classical cemetery has revealed 5 horse burials. I should qualify the classical cemetery point. This is an area where 5 classical horse burials have been found, but a lot of the classical graves have clearly been dug out to make way for Hellenistic and Roman burials. So even though the term classical cemetery is used in the reports, it's really not clear that this is anything like a classical cemetery. It's a bit dogmatic, in my view. Osteoarchaeological analysis reportedly reveals signs of slaughter and butchery. It appears that the horses were intentionally sacrificed and later reassembled in the graves. 4 of the graves retain evidence of inhumation, and it appears that the horse burials were therefore not disturbed, unlike many of other archaic and classical graves in the cemetery. Julie Up suggests that 2 of the burials can be associated with human graves, and that the graves were part of a family plot. Equine inhumation certainly is a fascinating display of wealth. The details of this interpretation should perhaps, however, be received with great caution. Until the associated pottery and detailed osteoarchaeological analysis is fully published, then these conclusions cannot be examined with the necessary level of informed critical insight. Regardless, the practice itself in archaic and classical Sparta, if the dating of these burials is assured, is of significance. On the part of those commissioning such burials, it suggests a level of wealth perhaps comparable to extremely wealthy Spartiates. As was suggested by Critobulus' comment above, when it came to agricultural matters, it only seemed necessary to appoint a bailiff or wage labour or other kind of rural supervision when there was a deficit in expertise or a lack of manpower. In a nice rhetorical gesture, he says, to be sure, even land is not wealth if it makes us starve instead of feeding us. It would only have been necessary to hire expertise in animal rearing if there was a deficit in knowledge. This most likely would have been if a homoios had recently purchased a flock of sheep or made some new investment. As with agricultural labour, I see the exchange of helots through property sharing as an equally likely possibility. And we now turn to the Spartan Agora, of which I think the full text should be. Oh, here we go. Okay, so there's the full, slightly unwieldy passage there, but it's certainly one of our fullest pieces of evidence for us. So I thought it was worth putting it, the whole thing on the handout. Oh, here we go. So again, I won't bother to read the whole thing out. So Philip Davis has recently produced a perceptive study of this passage, attempting to separate its narrative and historical elements. Xenophon's account cannot be trusted at face value, and nor should we exclude Xenophon from constructing a complex narrative. In spite of this, we should not assume that Sparta did not permit market exchange like any other Greek polis. The agora most likely functioned as a focus of regional exchange, as suggested by the reference to the sideros, where one was able to purchase all the various tools used in skilled or unskilled labour. This also suggests differentiation by product within the agora. Some activities, such as the buying and selling of land, may have been reserved for full citizens. Thucydides, in his discussion of the artimia imposed upon those who had surrendered their spectaria, mentions the fact that they lost their artimia and the right to buy and sell anything. Andrew suggests that the act of purchasing here refers to real property, i.e. land. Finlay likewise argued that this passage was fairly secure evidence of commercial exchange. This most likely does not refer to basic forms of exchange, but were perhaps only those that were reserved for citizens. Unless one was willing to argue that the entire iron market was run by homoioi, then it must be the case that certain forms of exchange were permitted for perioikoi. This is also suggested by the presence of multiple status groups within the agora, although what purposes brought them all to Sparta itself, we can only speculate. In terms of the perioikoi role here, it seems most probable that they acted as sellers of numerous products within the agora. There is some epigraphic evidence of what might be called makers' marks or signatures. They're just names carved on architectural blocks most often, which attest to such practices within Spartan territory. We have no evidence of helots being permitted to run businesses, as in Athens, and furthermore, many material resources, such as iron, were situated within the perioikos. If time were to permit, then a fuller discussion of how our archaeological data tallies with what we know about ancient craft work would be one avenue of future research. However, for now, I want to ask a final question about demand. It is often assumed that the Spartan economy maintained a system that was domestically focused, with very low levels of import and export. If this is perhaps true of the homoioi, then we should question whether this is also true for the perioikoi. Recent isotope analysis conducted on iron spits from inside the Parthenon, under the auspices of the Acropolis Restoration Service, has suggested that the isotope marker is one of Laconian iron. Since the Parthenon remained unfinished at the start of the Peloponnesian War, this would suggest an independent trade in iron persisted, in spite of hostilities between Athens and Sparta. Time does not permit me to discuss all the potential possibilities, and there are some good reasons for caution. For example, the plentiful supply of iron ore from all over Greece, and also iron's importance in manufacture of weaponry. So was it from captured weaponry? But we should at least consider if the perioikoi could afford to be entirely reliant on the demand of homoioi, especially if their product was well regarded and it was feasible to export. Were there any identifiable regulations that prevented perioikoi from doing this? There is no indication, for example, in Laconian iconography and painted pottery, something which could perhaps fall within the remit of elite consumption, that artists and painters were subject to ideological restrictions. Yanis Pikoulas's exhaustive study of the Laconian road network appears to identify a large cluster of roads, 14 in all, around Geronthrai, modern Geraki, suggesting that Sparta itself was not the focus of commercial activity, as Catling suggested in his publication of the Laconia survey. Clearly, certain products were provided by the polis. Spartan citizens were supposedly given only one cloak, and this particular garment seems to have been the subject of polis regulation. Yet this might just be the exception to a rule of permissibility. We do not yet know. Hopefully, however, this brief overview of the problem has presented a new direction for considering the economic position of the perioikoi. Conclusions. You can breathe a sigh of relief. What place do the Perioikoi actually occupy in Spartan economic history? It is probably the case that they were only weakly institutionally associated with the Spartan polis, and that whilst they were not autonomous polis, the level of daily intervention in the life of Perioikoi is minimal. This is reflected in their general lack of non-military obligations towards the Spartan polis. In the field of production and labour, it is likely that Perioikoi who either struggled or failed to access land would have been obliged to work for a living as either wage labourers or in more skilled professions. The agora at Sparta appears to have provided one means of exchange within the territory, but it seems possible that others existed at a local level, even if they were only occasional. What is totally unknown is in this particular avenue of study is the limitations on Perioikoi economic activity, and if indeed there were any. How reliable is the presumption that Sparta, understand homoioi, showed very little interest in overseas trade? These are different questions for another time, but I suspect if they are answered, then they would represent real progress. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thomas, for your paper, we'll just close here and return. To this.
Yes, there are.
Perfect. Yeah, we should be fine. Okay, great. So thank you very much. I'll just wanted to say a few words just for a few seconds, as this is our last seminar of the year. So I'd like to thank also in presence of our online audience and our audience here. So just some closing remarks for the year. So I'd like to thank all the attendees, who have attended our seminars throughout the year, our speakers, here represented by Thomas, and my fellow co-chairs, so William and Dees. So I guess we can agree that it's been a tiring but also rewarding and wonderful experience, and we enjoyed every minute, every Friday, I would say a bit. We're very grateful to Royal Holloway University for hosting us here in Bedford Square during the boycott of Senate House, and we will keep you updated and keep you posted about our future seminars. And lastly, I'd like to wish good luck to our new chairs, who will be in charge from the end of June. So Valentina, Barbara, and Kaylee. Somewhere. Thank you, and good luck for next year. So we'll see you all in September. So stay tuned. Thank you very much.